Welcome, and today we're going to do some introductory material related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The story, the legend almost, that begins our journey, it begins in 1948 with three Bedouin young men who were keeping their watching over the flock, and as they told the story, they heard or they lost one of their sheep and were throwing stones in to see if they could knock the sheep back to come back out, scared into coming back out. And instead of the sheep, they heard something break, and they went in there. The original hole was large enough for just a male adult to get through. And when they went in there, they found these scrolls, and I don't draw, so please don't, that they were long, thin jars with tops like that, and inside was the scroll, because back in those days, of course, they didn't have books. They everything was on a scroll. So they found, basically what they found came to be known as Cave 11, and if the story is long and convoluted because this was a bad time in that region. The region around the Dead Sea was owned or was under the control of the Jordanian government, and Jerusalem was a divided city. And so just getting something from one part of the city to the other became very, very complicated. And it took a while until someone recognized that what they had was really, really something special. It turned out that one of the first scrolls they found was the great Isaiah scroll. You can imagine, not just a long book, but a very important book. So it was quite a find, and so archaeologists eventually became aware of this. American and French. It was the French who led the archaeological work initially, and they found thousands and thousands of documents so there were a total of 11 caves. It's all been surveyed. I doubt there's anything going to be found now, and they included documents both sectarian and non-sectarian. We'll talk about that in a minute, and also a copy of every book of the Bible except for Esther. So we didn't, there's some speculation why Esther might not have been included, or whether it was just an accident that's the book that got completely destroyed. But and what we've come to realize is we have not a library, we have a library of a specific community, that Jewish community, but also had texts from all sorts of other places that have given us an amazing view into what Judaism looked like in the first century, second and first century BCE. Another thing that's important to remember is that that this was a period before the canon, and the idea, we think of Holy Scripture and we think of the Bible, and we have those books and no other. But there was a time before those books of the Hebrew Bible were identified as Scripture, and everything else was therefore identified as not Scripture. So we don't know necessarily which of these books they considered more holy than others. Obviously, the biblical material, and just to give you a rundown of what books we found the most copies of, Psalms was number 1, Deuteronomy number 2, Genesis number 4, Isaiah, the great Isaiah scroll, and many other copies, and 5, Exodus. And you can see a lot of what was concerning to them. Isaiah, the great messianic book, Psalms, worship, but Deuteronomy, Exodus, this Torah material, because they were very much understood themselves as a covenant people. What we found now also in terms of texts, and this has really changed our understanding of the biblical material, that we found the Masoretic text there, so the Hebrew, but we also found Hebrew versions of some of the Septuagint writings as well. So we have come to realize that the Septuagint wasn't just a translation of the Masoretic text, but there was an earlier Hebrew version that it was based on. We also, there's the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then perhaps some others. And so the farther back we go in time, the more versions of the Old Testament we have, of the Hebrew Bible, with at least 3 versions of the Torah material, and that all began in the Hebrew. So from one of the things that the Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us is that we go from more variety down to much more control and the idea that the text needs to be transferred in one form and one form only. So in terms of dates, again, 1948 with these Bedouins, young men. You'll perhaps get a sense of this in your readings in Nicholasberg and Murphy, but especially if you go to material written about the Dead Sea Scroll from the 20th century. The scrolls, when they were discovered, were divvied up among a small amount of scholars, both in France and mostly here in the United States. Yale and Harvard received a lot of them, and they were kept secret. So if you think by let's just give an outside date, by 1960, all the excavations had ended, and all of the scrolls were available. And so between 1948 and 1960, but the public was not given access to even the photographs of the scroll until 1991. So a lot of conspiracy theories actually there was a lot of belief that there were reasons why they were being hidden. Everything from they disproved Jesus or they proved Jesus, depending on who is coming up with the theory, the conspiracy, but I think we've all sort of figured out that mostly it was sort of academic. The academics work on a different time than the rest of the world, and just sort of a greed in a sense, and that not greed for money but greed for fame, and people were keeping it in for their favorite students and stuff like that. So the photographic copies of the scrolls were made available in 1991 against the will of those who were without the knowledge of those who actually had the original copies. So then the final translation of the scrolls occurred, the publication in 2002. So I was just thinking about this. I took a class in 1990 on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we had all sorts of questions that we just couldn't answer, and now it's just a whole different world. And so again, anything written between 1948 and 1991 at least has to be a little suspect, if for no other reason than the information was incomplete. But we also have to people were really speculating all sorts of things about why they were not made public. And now, of course, they're all available in translation. And then the photographs of the scrolls are all up online as well, if you're willing to go and try and translate the Hebrew. And when I say scrolls and documents, we've found everything from complete scrolls to things that, maybe were this big. And the idea that, there's photographs from the archaeologists of rats' nests, literally, where they would go through, just the dirt on the ground to find any scrap of paper that they could have found. And I say paper, but what they found there was mostly papyrus. Here, papyrus, or sometimes animal skins, or vellum. And so this was what they were written on. And of course, this is just so ephemeral that it really is the greatest discovery of, the 20th century, and perhaps much longer than that in terms of archaeology, because just the written word is so fragile. So what we do now most of the time, if we do, for people who do scroll research, they do it online. We're not allowed access to the scrolls directly in almost all cases. You start with the photographs, which is kind of interesting too, though, because if you've got a fragment, and you've got, a shape, it's you can play puzzle on a computer. Oh, look, that piece, you can move it around. I can't do it here, but I'm sort of, oh, look, that looks like it might join up to that. So there you have a match. And do that on a large scale, on a small scale. They've done DNA analysis on the animal skins to figure out where they've come, how we can put pieces of a scroll together based on the DNA of the animal skin. You can, again, this whole puzzle piece kind of thing. But there, and, laying, if you can imagine a scroll, so you've got a scroll like this, and sorry about my handwriting there, with the hand, one of the ways they can, if it falls apart, you can still sort of reconstruct it, like there's a hole all the way through to the center. Anyway, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to how fascinating it is that they, then unroll it, and if they can roll it back up and all the damage points meet. Anyway, it's very, very interesting. But unfortunately, the damage that we have done to the scrolls in the last 50 years is beyond what the last, 2000. Their exposure to light, their exposure to just even the oil on our hands. What makes me almost weep, some of you may be old enough to remember back, or from your grandparents, cellophane or sellotape, which was the precursor of Scotch tape. They used that when they wanted to they put it on glass and so that they could look at it, and without touching it, they taped it down to the glass. And so a lot of the work these days is on the restoration, and the restoration, at least in part, from the damage that we did after their discovery. So there's a lot of really fun stuff on the internet that about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the preservation of the scrolls. I encourage you to look it up. They were here in Raleigh several years ago now. Maybe you had a chance to go, but it's really fascinating, and an insight that we're not often afforded this far after the fact. So they found the scrolls on the Dead Sea, or on the western side of the Dead Sea, which is now Israel, and near where they found Cave 11, and it's a very famous shot from Qumran. You can look across to this cave that's sort of you have to drop into it, and it's very, very interesting. You can't do it anymore. But nearby the caves, we found a ruin that goes by the name of Qumran. This is not the name they use for themselves, but this is the name that was attached to the archaeological site. And it has been pretty much generally accepted that this is that what we found in those caves were was the library of this community that in Daras, probably at the time of the Roman siege of Jerusalem between 68 and 70 CE, they hid their libraries because the Romans were just wandering through this region. If some of you may have heard of Masada, which did not fall, which hold up against the Romans until 73. Masada is also on the Dead Sea Scroll. Excuse me, on the Dead Sea. So it's close enough that you can imagine that there were lots of Roman soldiers and armies, and that it was not really a safe time period. And so what we gather is they hid them, and then they never really made it back to get them. The community disbanded at that point. So what we do know then, just to be a tad bit more specific, is if we go back to the 7th, 8th century BCE, there was a small settlement there, but it was not occupied again until the 1st century of BCE. And again, we date it to sometime around 70 when the rest of this region was under attack. There's that this community was an active community. After 70, it was a Roman garrison for a short period of time, and then we find later medieval Bedouin and Islamic evidence. Not that it was ever re-inhabited, but it seemed like a place that pilgrims or Bedouins or people would stay in, mostly because we know this from the cemetery, where there's a large number of bodies that clearly belong to this period. But we find Roman coins and other Roman evidence, and then later burials that seem to be more religiously connected to the Islamic period. So again, this is the period that we are all excited about, that is the one for the Dead Sea. And what we find when we look at this site is clearly this was not a normal village. We use the term sectarian, that this was inhabited by a sectarian Jewish group, so they were Jewish, but they had one or two small differences. That's why they're sectarian. And the couple of the things just from the archaeology of it that shows us that it was a religious site and not just a normal village or small villa. And first was the idea of ritual bathing. The way that the water system is set up to run through the entire encampment, and the way that there was water at every access point, shows us huge pools for bathing, and they just and to hold the water and keep the water, that is clearly not just for agriculture, for human use. So another element, we found an entire room full of pottery. It looks like maybe that was all evenly let on shelves, and it just collapsed straight down, but it's enough to feed a lot of people. So this little room of pottery, all stacked up neatly, waiting to be used, next to a much larger room that very well could have been a dining room. And so we get this idea of some corporate meals, communal meals, and also a large pit of animal bones. So that makes us think perhaps, that the ritual sacrifice of and eating of an animal was part of Jewish culture, so that they were carrying out sacrifices in the at Qumran. And then also there's a very, very large room on the second floor that some people does not seem to have been for sleeping, but rather a library, or some people say perhaps a scriptorium, a place for the copying and preservation of this library, because it had to have gone somewhere. So we found a lot of, just sort of to recap, we found a lot of scrolls in caves. We found a site nearby, and all of those were, what we found were lots and lots of Jewish documents, both biblical and non-biblical, but also then a site that looks very much like it was a part of a religious community. And now we'll talk more about who that community might be, but it's pretty much generally agreed that these documents and that archaeological site were the same thing. So another question has come up, is like, so, who was there? It's so difficult to know that, but here's the, what do you go by? Well, there's a cemetery, so that gives us some sense, perhaps, and then there's all these dishes or pottery that I was talking about, but their sleeping quarters are difficult to find. So some people go as high as maybe 150 people who inhabited the site, and then they would live in camps or tents around the outside of the permanent structure. To, if you actually look at the remains themselves, you have as many as 10 to 20 that could have probably slept inside. So it's still an issue, but I will say that what most people think now is that, and let me say that the primary archaeologist on the site was a Roman Catholic, and so he used his own tradition and really saw this perhaps as some form of monastery, a religious retreat house for perhaps a larger group, and we'll talk about that, and so that you would have had lots of, maybe some few permanent residents, but some more transient residents who would come and go. Now, based on the cemetery, the idea is that it was, people have speculated that it was a celibate male community, because all of the bodies in the cemetery that date to the right period for this community are male, and that's a difficult kind of judgment to make, but there does seem to be an indication that at the very least they saw themselves as a priestly community, and of course the priests themselves who served would have been all male. Whether they were celibate, whether it was an all-male community with no women there at all, we don't know. But I'll say this before and talk about it more as we go on. The people at Qumran, once we start reading their material, you will realize saw themselves as the temple in exile. That whatever was going on in Jerusalem was so wrong. And we've read Enoch, and you could see Enoch 90 saw the temple as a negative place. The temple, the high priesthood was being bought and sold, and so there was this real belief that that was corrupted beyond hope at this point, the temple in Jerusalem, so they went off to continue the ritual sacrifices in the desert until such time they could take back control of the temple and get it right. And so again, a lot of this is based on calendars and all that. But the temple in exile, this is really, just to give you a bit of a taste of where we're going with all this. So I think I'm going to stop here, but then I want to talk about the what's in the scrolls, the community, what do we know about the people who preserved these scrolls, and some general information about what the scrolls contain.